The sun was beginning its slow descent over the Pacific, casting a golden hue over the cliffs of Point Reyes. The coastline of Northern California was rugged and raw, with jagged rocks jutting out into the vast, endless ocean. The Point Reyes lighthouse, perched on the very edge of the peninsula, had weathered the storms of over 150 years. Its light, which had once been a beacon of hope for lost sailors, now seemed to emit a faint, eerie glow that cast long shadows over the cliffs. Ever since the lighthouse was built in 1870, locals had whispered about strange happenings around the area. The fog that rolled in from the sea, thick and impenetrable, seemed to hold secrets. The light from the lighthouse flickered sometimes, even on clear nights, and the wind carried strange sounds, whispers, moans, and, on rare occasions, screams. The residents of nearby Inverness had grown accustomed to the unusual nature of the place, but there was a sense of unease that lingered in the air. They knew better than to venture near the lighthouse after dark. David Mallory, a journalist from San Francisco, had always been fascinated by urban legends and supernatural tales. When he arrived in Point Reyes to write an article about the lighthouse for a travel magazine, he was unaware of the peculiarities surrounding the place. To David, it was just another historical landmark, another story waiting to be uncovered. But when he stepped off the bus in Inverness, he was immediately struck by the isolation. The small town was quiet, save for the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs in the distance. The locals were friendly enough but reserved, offering polite smiles and vague answers when David inquired about the lighthouse. No one seemed eager to discuss it in detail, though David could tell there was more to the place than they were willing to share. His curiosity piqued. David set off on foot toward the lighthouse the next morning. The walk was long, winding through thick groves of cypress trees, the salty sea air heavy with the scent of pine. As he neared the lighthouse, he could hear the soft, constant hum of the foghorn in the distance, a sound that was both comforting and ominous. When he arrived at the base of the lighthouse, he was greeted by a park ranger named Carla, who had been working at Point Reyes for over a decade. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, but there was something in her gaze that made David pause. "New to the area?" Carla asked, her voice friendly but cautious. David nodded. "Just arrived yesterday. I'm here to write about the lighthouse. It's a fascinating spot." Carla's expression faltered for a moment before she regained her composure. "It's an interesting place, all right. Beautiful, but there's a lot of history here. Some of it isn't so easy to explain." David raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Carla glanced around, almost as if making sure no one was listening, before she lowered her voice. "There are a lot of stories about this place. Things people have seen or heard, but most folks around here don't talk about it much. You do best to stick to the facts, if you know what I mean." David's interest was immediately piqued. "What kind of stories?" Carla hesitated but eventually spoke. "There's an old legend about the fog here. Some people say it's not just fog, that it carries voices, whispers sometimes. Others claim it carries something else, something darker. You see, a lot of ships crashed around Point Reyes before the lighthouse was built. Many of the sailors, they never came back. Their bodies were lost at sea, and some say their spirits never left David's heart quickened. The tales of ghost ships and restless spirits were common in places like this, but there was something about Carla's tone, something more than just local legend. "Do you believe it?" he asked. Carla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to face the lighthouse, her gaze far away. "I don't know what to believe," she finally said. But I've heard things, seen things even, and there are others here who have too. Just be careful." David looked up at the lighthouse, its white stone gleaming in the morning light. From a distance it seemed calm, serene, like a relic from a bygone era. But standing at its base, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, something just out of sight. "Thanks for the warning," he said, though he couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement at the thought of uncovering whatever secrets the lighthouse held. Carla nodded curtly. "Stay close to the path. And don't stay out there after dark. Trust me, you'll understand why when the fog rolls in." As she walked away, David stood for a moment, staring up at the lighthouse. He wasn't sure whether Carla's warnings were simply the result of overactive imaginations or something more substantial, but he was determined to find out. He had heard rumors about strange occurrences near the lighthouse, the inexplicable flickering of the light, the feeling of being watched. But until he witnessed something for himself, he couldn't write about it. David decided to spend the day exploring. He walked the narrow path leading to the lighthouse and stood on the edge of the cliffs, overlooking the vast, churning ocean. The sky was overcast, and the fog had begun to roll in, thickening by the minute. The wind picked up, and David could feel the temperature dropping as the day wore on. The eerie quiet of the place seemed to intensify as the fog swallowed everything around him. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard it. A voice, faint, barely audible, carried by the wind. It was not a voice that could be clearly understood, but there was something about it. It was distant, yet unmistakable. David spun around, his heart racing, but there was no one in sight. The fog had deepened, and the path ahead was now a blurred maze of white. David's pulse quickened. The voice seemed to echo in his mind, a whisper on the edge of hearing. But when he tried to follow it, the sound faded, and the fog closed in. A shiver ran down his spine. It was impossible to deny it now. Something was not right here. David took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. The rational part of his mind told him it was just the wind playing tricks, that the sound of the foghorn could create strange auditory illusions. But the unease in his chest only grew as he stood in the thickening mist, trying to shake off the sensation that something, someone, was watching him. He decided to press on. His mission was clear: to uncover the history, the mysteries, and the truths of the Point Reyes lighthouse. If the fog had a voice, he would find out why. It wasn't just about telling the stories of the town. It was about understanding the strange events that had plagued this lighthouse for generations. He had to dive deeper, beyond the polite smiles and warnings from the locals, to get to the heart of what truly made Point Reyes such an enigmatic place. David retraced his steps, walking along the path that led up toward the lighthouse. The fog was becoming denser, now so thick that the lighthouse itself was little more than a vague silhouette in the distance. It wasn't just the weather that had him on edge. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to hang over everything. The low, constant hum of the foghorn sent a chill down his spine as he walked. By the time David reached the lighthouse, the fog had completely enveloped him. The light from the tower cut through the mist, casting long, ghostly shadows over the rocks below. The sound of the foghorn was deafening now, echoing through the cliffs and filling the silence with an unnerving persistence. Standing at the base of the lighthouse, David felt the weight of the place. It wasn't just a historical landmark or a scenic viewpoint. There was something ancient here, something unspoken. The air felt different, charged. He instinctively glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the fog. But there was nothing, just the lighthouse standing resolute against the elements. And yet, despite its imposing presence, David could feel it, an unseen force, something just beneath the surface, watching. "Can I help you?" The voice startled him. He turned to see a man in his mid-40s, wearing a weathered coat, standing just a few feet away. He looked like he belonged to the place, his face creased with the years of exposure to the coastal winds. His eyes were dark, unblinking, and there was a quiet intensity about him, as if he knew exactly what David was thinking. David hesitated for a moment, but then introduced himself. "I'm David Mallory. I'm writing about the lighthouse and its history. I was hoping to learn more from someone who's spent time here." The man nodded, a flicker of something crossing his face, though it was gone almost immediately. "Well, you're not the first to come looking. People come from all over, thinking they'll get the full story. But I'll tell you now, this place, this lighthouse, has a way of making people forget what they came for." David raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" The man sighed and looked out toward the ocean. His voice lowered, as if he were speaking to himself. "The fog has a way of making people lose track of time. They come, they wander, they get lost. Not just in the mist, but in their own thoughts. Sometimes they forget why they came. Sometimes they don't come back." David's heart skipped a beat, but he pressed on. "What do you mean?" "People have disappeared." The man gave him a knowing look, his expression grave. "Not just disappeared. Lost, like they got caught up in something they couldn't explain. Some folks think it's just the fog. But others, those who've been around long enough, think it's something more. The sea has a way of taking people, David. And it doesn't always just take their bodies. It takes their minds too. It leaves them stranded out there, in that thick mist. And before they know it, they're part of it." David was silent for a moment. He had heard about the disappearances, but hearing it from someone who seemed to believe it so deeply gave the stories an undeniable weight. He needed to know more. "I'm sorry," David said finally, trying to regain some composure. "But who are you?" "You work here?" The man's eyes shifted toward him, and for a brief second, something flickered, something dark, something that David couldn't quite place. "I'm Garrett," the man replied shortly. "I used to work the lighthouse. Now, I just take care of the grounds. There's not much to maintain out here. The light does its job, but the rest, well, that's the thing. People don't stay here long enough to notice the other side of it. There's a side to the lighthouse people don't talk about. You're better off not digging too deep." David watched Garrett carefully, sensing the layers beneath his words. There was a heaviness in the way he spoke, an air of warning that David couldn't ignore. "Do you believe it?" David asked quietly. "That people get lost? That the lighthouse or the fog does something to them?" Garrett didn't answer right away. He stood there, staring into the mist, before turning back toward David. His eyes were cold, almost distant, as though he were trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally he spoke. "The fog doesn't just hide things. It hides people. It hides things that shouldn't be here anymore," Garrett said slowly, his voice low. "This place is old. Older than people realize. People like to think the fog's just weather. It's not. It's a barrier between this world and something else. Something lost." David's skin prickled, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the history that surrounded him. The fog was no longer just a weather phenomenon. It was something more. Something that carried memories, lost souls, and whispers from the past. Garrett turned to leave, but then paused. "You're welcome to stay around here. But when the fog rolls in, when it starts to feel wrong, don't stay too long. You won't be able to leave, not the way you came. And if you do, you'll never forget what you saw." With that, Garrett walked off into the mist, disappearing from sight within seconds. David stood there, alone at the base of the lighthouse, trying to process what Garrett had said. He glanced up at the tower, its light sweeping across the waves, and then back at the thick fog that had consumed the area. Something wasn't right. He felt it in his bones. There was more to Point Reyes and its lighthouse than simple ghost stories or local legends. This place, this fog, had something hidden, and David Mallory was determined to uncover it. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped as the fog deepened. David turned to leave, but before he could take more than a few steps, he heard it again. The whisper. Faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. "Stay." David froze. The whisper seemed to settle over him like a thick, damp blanket, so close that it felt as though the very air had spoken directly into his ear. David turned sharply, his heart racing, but there was nothing but the heavy mist that stretched out endlessly in all directions. It was impossible to pinpoint the source of the voice. The fog was so thick now, it was as if the world had folded in on itself. The lighthouse loomed above him, its light cutting through the darkness like a steady pulse. For a brief, unsettling moment, David wondered if the whispers he had been hearing were merely his mind playing tricks on him, the isolation of the place seeping into his thoughts. But then, just as he was about to shake off the feeling, the whisper came again. "Stay. Stay with us." The voice was no longer a vague echo, but a clear, unmistakable command. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a trick of the fog. It was something else entirely. David's breath hitched as the fog around him seemed to shift, coiling and undulating like a living entity, pulling him toward the lighthouse. The eerie light from the tower, which had once seemed so steady and calm, now flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the rocks. David's first instinct was to run, to get as far away from the lighthouse as possible. But his feet felt heavy, as though the fog was weighing him down. His body felt sluggish, reluctant to move. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, binding him in place. He swallowed hard, trying to push the irrational fear back down. There had to be an explanation. He had heard the stories about the fog, about people becoming disoriented, getting lost in the mist. But this was different. There was something deliberate, almost personal, about the way the voice had spoken to him. It wasn't just a random sound carried by the wind. David forced his feet to move, stepping cautiously toward the lighthouse. As he approached, the fog seemed to grow denser, the air colder. Each step made the world around him more oppressive, more suffocating. He could no longer hear the sound of the ocean crashing below, nor the low hum of the foghorn that had been so constant earlier. Instead, there was a deep silence, a heavy, expectant quiet, broken only by his own heartbeat and the distant flicker of the lighthouse beam. He reached the entrance of the lighthouse, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The heavy iron door, which had once stood as a symbol of guidance and safety for mariners, now looked ominous and foreboding. For a moment he hesitated, his hand hovering over the door's rusted handle. He thought about Garrett's warning, the words about staying too long. about the fog hiding things, about the lost souls that roamed these cliffs. But the door beckoned him. It felt almost inevitable. The voice, the whisper, seemed to be drawing him inside, urging him to cross the threshold. And so, with a mixture of dread and curiosity, David pushed open the door. The interior was dark, save for the flickering light from the tower above, casting shifting shadows across the walls. Dust hung in the air, undisturbed by any recent visitor. The walls were lined with old maritime tools, brass compasses, ancient maps, and photographs of sailors long gone. But it wasn't the history of the place that grabbed David's attention. It was the overwhelming feeling of presence, the sensation that he was not alone. The temperature inside the lighthouse dropped suddenly, and David shivered. It felt as though something cold and ancient was pressing in on him, making it difficult to breathe. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the darkened space, his senses on high alert. The beams of light from the lighthouse flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a faint sound cut through the silence. A shuffle, like the sound of feet dragging across the floor. David's head snapped around, but there was nothing, no sign of movement, no figure. He took another step forward, the air growing even colder, until the hair on the back of his neck stood up. There was a low hum now, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, reverberating in the walls, in his very bones. It was coming from somewhere high up, above, in the lantern room. His heart raced as he ascended the spiral staircase, the creaking of the old iron steps echoing in the silence. The hum grew louder with each step, and with it, the air seemed to thicken, pressing against him like a heavy weight. As he reached the top, the light from the lantern room washed over him, and for the briefest moment, David thought he saw something, a figure standing motionless in the light. His breath caught, and his pulse quickened. But when he blinked, the figure was gone. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the cold, smooth railing, eyes darting around the room. The hum was deafening now. David turned to the center of the lantern room, where the great light turned slowly in a circle, casting its long beam out over the cliffs and ocean below. The light seemed brighter than before, almost blinding, its brilliance too sharp. And then, as if on cue, the whisper came again, this time louder than before. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was coming from everywhere. The sound seemed to reverberate through the very structure of the lighthouse, filling David's ears, his mind. "Stay with us, David. Come closer." The words were now unmistakable, and the voice, though faint, was somehow familiar. He could hear the desperation, the longing in it, and for a moment David felt a deep ache in his chest. It was as though the voice knew him, recognized him. The longing was so palpable that he almost took a step forward, as if drawn by some invisible force. But then, in the depths of his confusion, David suddenly realized he didn't want to come closer. This was no ordinary phenomenon. The lighthouse was not just a source of light. It was a conduit, a channel that linked something ancient to this world. Something that should not be here, but was. He had already felt it, in the fog, in the whispers, in the very air around him. And now, in the lantern room, he felt it again, the unmistakable presence of something old, something lost. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward. The light from the lantern room flashed brighter, blinding him for a moment. And when his vision cleared, he saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the room. A sailor, his face obscured by shadows, his body draped in tattered clothes that seemed to move with the wind. though there was no breeze. His eyes, dark and hollow, stared at David with an intensity that made him freeze. The figure was surrounded by an unnatural stillness, as though time itself had come to a halt. David opened his mouth to scream, but the words were swallowed by the silence. The figure lifted a hand, pointing directly at him, and for a moment David saw something in the man's outstretched palm, a ship's wheel, gleaming as if it were alive. "Come closer," the voice whispered once again, this time with finality. "You are one of us now." David's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to turn, to run. He dashed down the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the hum of the lighthouse now a constant roar in his ears. The fog had thickened even further, swallowing the ground beneath his feet as he reached the door. And then, as he stepped outside, the voice followed him, echoing in the fog, lingering in the air like a spectre. "You can never leave." David's pulse was racing as he stumbled into the dense fog, the weight of the voice still pressing against his chest, suffocating him. His lungs burned with each desperate breath, but no matter how quickly he ran, the fog seemed to tighten around him, holding him in place. The lighthouse towered behind him, its light now blindingly bright, and the hum of the lantern room still resonated in his mind, a constant buzz that wouldn't let go. Every step he took felt like he was moving through water, heavy and thick, as though the air itself was conspiring against him. The whisper had stopped, but the presence, it lingered, lingering in the fog, in the darkness, in every corner of his mind. David could feel something watching him, moving just beyond the edges of his vision. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its gaze, cold and ancient. He tried to push through the fog, his legs aching with the effort, but no matter which way he turned, the landscape remained the same. The path he had walked earlier seemed to have vanished, and now there was only the fog, the oppressive, suffocating fog that felt as though it was closing in on him, inch by inch. The thought of running back to the town, to safety, crossed his mind, but something told him that there was no going back. No matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he moved, the fog would never let him escape. This place, Point Reyes, the lighthouse, the fog itself, it was not just a physical location. It was something else, something that defied the laws of the world, something that was alive. And then, just when he thought he might collapse from exhaustion, he heard it again. "Come back." The voice was softer now, distant, but still unmistakable. It was as though the fog itself was speaking to him, calling him home. The chilling thing was that the voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded familiar. There was an odd comfort to it, a pull that made David feel as though he wasn't alone. It was as though something in him recognized it, something deep and buried that had been dormant for years, perhaps his entire life. David stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting around, trying to pinpoint the source. He felt the fog closing in around him, thick and all-encompassing, and his thoughts were becoming fogged as well. His mind was clouded with confusion, and the voice, it called again, gentle, pleading. "Stay with us, David." This time it wasn't just a voice in the distance. It was a presence, swirling around him, echoing in the very air. David's heart hammered in his chest, his hands shaking as he reached out in the direction of the voice. He tried to speak, to shout out against it, but his voice was swallowed by the fog as if it never existed. And then, as though answering his unspoken question, the mist parted slightly. In the distance, a faint light flickered, dim, but enough to catch his attention. He couldn't tell if it was a trick of the fog, but it seemed like a doorway, an opening in the otherwise impenetrable veil. Without thinking, he began walking toward the light, the voice guiding him, urging him forward. Each step felt more automatic, more inevitable, as if he were being led by something he couldn't see, but knew was there. Waiting. The fog seemed to thin the closer he got, the darkness giving way to a faint, pale glow. David could barely make out the outline of what looked like an old wooden ship, half buried in the sand. It was a ship he recognized from the images he had seen in the lighthouse, the ship wheel, the tattered sails, and the worn hull. But this ship was different. It didn't belong here. David stepped forward, his feet crunching on the sand beneath him. The ship stood alone in the fog, as though it had been there for centuries, waiting for something. Or someone. "It's time," the voice said again, now behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The fog had receded entirely now, and in its place stood the ship, looming impossibly close. David swallowed hard, his heart pounding. "What is this?" He whispered to no one. The fog had disappeared, and yet something about the scene felt so wrong, so out of place. The ship shouldn't be here. It was as though it had been conjured from the depths of his own mind. As he took another step toward the ship, the ground beneath his feet shifted. The ship, which had appeared to be half sunken in the sand, suddenly creaked and groaned. Its hull seemed to move, rising from the sand as though it were alive, and the sea around it, David could hear it now, began to churn. The tide rose, a tide that seemed unnatural, a tide that was drawn toward the ship. "Stay with us, David." The voice was clearer now, a chorus of voices, many layered together, all calling his name in unison. His name, repeated over and over, until it became an echo in the very fabric of the fog. The wind howled, carrying the sound of distant waves crashing against the ship's side. David's chest tightened. It felt as though the ship, the fog, the voices, they were all connected. This wasn't just some ghostly apparition. This was something ancient, something lost, and it was reaching for him. In that moment, he realized what he had to do. He wasn't meant to find answers. He wasn't meant to escape. The lighthouse, the fog, the voices, they had all been leading him here. And the moment he had stepped into the mist, he had sealed his fate. With a deep breath, David stepped onto the ship, feeling its cold wooden deck under his feet. The moment he did, the voices intensified, swirling around him in a cacophony of sound. The ship seemed to move beneath him, rocking gently, as though it were setting sail once more. The fog, now gone completely, had been replaced with a kind of stillness, as though the world had gone silent, waiting for what was to come next. Suddenly, the ship lurched, and David staggered forward, grabbing hold of the ship's wheel. The rusted metal was cold to the touch, and as his fingers closed around it, the wheel began to turn on its own. The ship shuddered as it began to sail, drifting out to sea with unnatural speed, cutting through the water like it had never been stationary. David gripped the wheel, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure what was happening, but the voices had stopped, replaced by a strange sense of calm. He wasn't alone on the ship, but he wasn't sure who or what was with him. The air had become thick again, as though the very atmosphere of the place had changed, becoming heavier, more oppressive. And then, from the depths of the ship, from the very heart of it, came a sound, a whisper so soft that it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't the voices anymore. It was something else, something far older. "Welcome home, David." David's grip on the wheel tightened as the ship sailed into the blackness of the sea. There was no turning back now. He had crossed the threshold, and the fog would never let him go. The whispers echoed, and the ship sailed on, deeper into the unknown. The ship continued its steady, relentless journey through the foggy sea, its course set by an unseen hand. David clung to the wheel, his knuckles white, as though somehow instinctively understanding that he was not in control. The water beneath the ship was unnervingly still, as though the ocean itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sound of the wind was gone. The only thing he could hear was the steady creaking of the ship's wooden frame and the soft lapping of water against the hull. Everything felt suspended, as though time had somehow paused around him, and the only thing that mattered was the ship, the wheel, and the whispers. "Welcome home, David." The words whispered again, softer this time, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. David's heart raced. The realization that this place, this ship, was not of the world he had known, hit him like a physical blow. He was no longer on the shores of Point Reyes. This was somewhere else, somewhere ancient, far beyond the reach of time and reason. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a gateway, a bridge between realms. And somehow, David had been drawn into it. With a sudden jolt, the ship lurched forward, cutting through the still waters. The fog had thickened once more, surrounding them entirely, and the light from the lighthouse was now a faint, distant memory. David could no longer see the horizon. He was in the heart of an ocean that seemed infinite, and yet he knew, instinctively, that this was a place that existed outside of ordinary time. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. The whispers had faded, leaving only the eerie stillness of the sea around him. It was as though the ship itself was carrying him further into the unknown, into a place where nothing made sense, a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. Suddenly, a figure appeared before him, stepping out of the fog with a slow, deliberate pace. David's breath caught in his throat. It was a man, tall and thin, his face hidden in shadow, but the eerie stillness in the air seemed to emanate from him. The figure moved silently, as if he were part of the fog itself, his footsteps making no sound as he crossed the deck of the ship. "Who are you?" David whispered, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. He stood before David, his eyes dark and endless, staring into David's soul as though reading his every thought. The air around them grew colder, and David could feel his heartbeat in his ears. The ship seemed to move slower now, almost as if it was gliding, weightless on the water. The fog swirled around them in unnatural patterns, growing thicker with every passing second. "You've come," the man said at last, his voice deep and gravelly, though it carried no warmth. "I knew you would. You've always been here, David." David's mind spun. "What do you mean? Where am I? What is this place?" The man smiled, though it was not a comforting smile. It was cold, knowing, like someone who had seen and experienced things that were far beyond human comprehension. "You're in the heart of the fog. This place has no name, but it has many forms. Some call it the lost world. Some call it the depths, and some call it home." David's breath hitched. "Home? This is a dream, a nightmare. I don't belong here." The man's eyes softened for a moment, and David could have sworn he saw a flicker of sympathy in them, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "It's not about where you belong. It's about where you were meant to be," the man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The fog found you, David. It has always been with you. You are one of us now." David's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "I don't understand. Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The man stepped closer, and for the first time, David saw the full breadth of his features. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his face was angular, sharp, with hollow cheeks. His clothes were old, tattered and faded, as though he had stepped out of another century. And his eyes, those dark, endless eyes, held a truth that David couldn't fathom. "I am the keeper," the man said. "I've guided the lost for centuries. I am the one who brings those who wander through the fog to their rightful place. Some choose to stay, some choose to leave. But once the fog finds you, David, there is no escape." David stepped back, his body trembling with fear. The ship creaked under his feet, and the fog seemed to swirl even more violently, as though it were alive, hungry, and waiting. "No! I won't stay here. I want to go back. Please! You can't keep me here." The keeper's eyes flashed with something resembling pity. "It's not about what you want anymore, David. The fog has marked you, and the fog always collects its due." David's mind reeled. He turned, desperately searching for a way to escape, but the ship had taken on a life of its own. The wheels spun with a force he couldn't control, and the fog closed in around them, trapping them on this endless, drifting sea. He ran to the edge of the deck, his pulse racing. But when he peered over the side, there was nothing, just the impenetrable blackness of the fog, swirling, endless. "Please," David pleaded, his voice cracking. "I don't belong here. I need to leave. You don't understand." The keeper remained motionless, watching David with a sad, almost resigned expression. "You've always belonged here. You just didn't know it. The fog knew you would come. It called to you, and you followed. Now, you are part of the fog. The ship will never return. This is your home now." David turned back to face the keeper, his hands gripping the railing. His mind felt clouded, heavy with the realization that his fate had already been sealed, long before he ever arrived at the lighthouse. The fog had always been a part of him, waiting for him to discover its truth. But then, something else, something deeper, shifted within him. The fog was not just a force of nature. It was a reflection of his own thoughts, his own fears. And now, the fog was offering him something, an answer, a way out. But at what cost? He swallowed hard and turned away from the keeper, his resolve hardening. "I won't stay here," he said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "I'll find my way back." The keeper said nothing. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows of the ship, his figure dissolving into the mist. The whispers that had surrounded David were now quiet, leaving only the sound of the ship's creaking as it glided through the dark, unknown waters. David took a deep breath. The ship might have been carrying him deeper into the fog, but he was not going to let it take him completely. Not yet. The fog might have always been with him, but he wasn't ready to surrender. Not when he still had a chance to break free. With one final glance at the dark figure of the keeper disappearing into the fog, David turned toward the wheel. He would find a way out. He had to. The ship moved onward, through the fog, into the endless waiting night. The fog thickened around David once more, becoming a tangible presence that seemed to breathe with him, drawing him deeper into its fold. The ship, a silent and ever-moving entity, seemed to obey no natural laws. Its path was aimless, drifting through the heavy mist as if guided by something far older than the very ocean beneath it. Every inch of the air felt charged, as if something far beyond David's understanding was in control. He stood at the wheel, his grip tightening as he fought the overwhelming sense of hopelessness pressing against him. The keeper's words had haunted him, echoing in his mind, leaving behind a chilling certainty. This was his place now. The fog had claimed him, and there was no turning back. Yet David refused to accept it. He couldn't. He wouldn't. The ship creaked in response to his touch, as though it were alive, responding to his defiance. The fog, too, seemed to react, swirling around him in more frantic patterns, as if resisting his will to steer it, to take control. For a moment, David felt as if he were fighting an invisible force, a battle between the fog's dominance and his own desire to break free. He took another step forward, shifting his position at the wheel. The fog parted briefly, revealing a flicker of light in the distance, a soft, golden glow that didn't belong. David squinted, hoping for some sign of salvation, some indication of what lay beyond this endless mist. The ship surged toward it, its movement quickening, propelled by forces he couldn't comprehend. As the light grew closer, he saw it clearly now. A lighthouse, standing in stark contrast to the swirling chaos of the fog. But this lighthouse was different. Unlike the Point Reyes lighthouse, which had always been a guide for sailors, this one seemed to loom as a sinister monument, casting its light over the sea with a harsh, blinding intensity. The fog around it was parting, as if it were retreating from the beacon's glow, reluctant to be exposed. David's breath caught in his throat. The lighthouse was familiar yet wrong. This was not the lighthouse he had seen when he first arrived, but something else entirely, something that had emerged from the fog, pulling him toward it. The ship was moving faster now, its course seemingly predetermined. "Turn back, David." The voice came softly, as if whispered directly into his ear. He froze, the keeper's voice again. It was not a demand, but a warning, as if the lighthouse itself was aware of his approach. David hesitated for a moment, but the ship's motion was no longer his to control. The wheel spun of its own accord, faster now, pulling him toward the lighthouse. The light above grew ever brighter, and the fog thinned, parting in dramatic swaths as the ship cut through it. David could see more now. Sea spray clung to the wood of the ship's hull. The water beneath them roiled, churning in a way that was unnatural, as though something deep below the surface was awakening. His stomach churned with the realization. The fog, the voices, the lighthouse, it was all connected. He had thought they were isolated phenomena, but now he understood. The lighthouse was not just a point of navigation. It was a threshold, a gateway, and the fog had been keeping him from seeing the truth, keeping him from reaching it. David gripped the wheel tighter. He wasn't sure why he was doing it. The pull of the lighthouse was irresistible, its glow like a magnet drawing him closer. But part of him, the part that had fought this madness from the beginning, urged him to resist. The ship groaned in protest, its timbers creaking and straining under the unseen forces that seemed to control it. David's mind was clouded, the whispers returning louder, more insistent. They urged him forward, beckoning him toward the lighthouse. "Come closer, David. Come home." David closed his eyes for a moment, his mind spinning. Home. This was not home. This place, this ship, this fog, was not his world. He was not meant to be here, and yet the very air around him seemed to demand otherwise. When he opened his eyes again, the lighthouse was impossibly close. It was massive now, towering over the ship, its beams slicing through the darkness. The ship was on a direct course for the towering structure. There was no stopping it now, no turning back. Suddenly, the fog around the lighthouse cleared entirely, and David saw it, no longer a mere structure, but a vision, a vast spectral manifestation. The lighthouse was surrounded by dark shadows, like figures watching from the depths of the sea. They seemed to emerge from the ocean itself, impossibly tall, their forms indistinct but undeniably there, spirit-like beings that seemed to be drawn to the light as if it called to them, as if it had awakened them from their slumber. David's heart raced. The air was now electric, with an oppressive energy that made it impossible to breathe, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from the lighthouse. The light swept across the water, reflecting off the fog, illuminating a hidden world, one that David had never seen but somehow recognized. The figures in the water seemed to notice him then, their eyes, if they had eyes, fixing on him. The air grew heavier, colder, and then, in a voice that was not his own, David heard the words, barely audible over the roaring sea. "You are part of us now. You cannot leave." The ship shuddered beneath him, as if in response to the command, and David's grip on the wheel loosened involuntarily. It wasn't him controlling the ship anymore. It was them. The figures in the water, the lighthouse, the fog. They had taken over, pulling him into their world, locking him into their reality. He fought to stay conscious, but it felt as if the fog was seeping into his very mind, erasing his thoughts, his memories, his sense of self. The whispers swirled around him again, now a chorus, a cacophony of voices from the past, from the depths, from the ship. They filled his head, drowned him in their insistent call. "Stay, stay with us. You belong here. This is your fate." David stumbled backward, away from the wheel, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat closed up, his body trembling as the figures, those twisted, shadowy forms, rose from the water, creeping toward the ship. The ship itself groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through his bones. It was then that David realized the full horror of it all. The fog was not just an obstacle, it was a barrier, a prison, and the lighthouse was its warden. The figures, the ship, the voices, they were all part of the same curse, a cycle that repeated itself over and over, pulling souls like his into its grasp, never allowing them to escape. David's mind began to fracture, his thoughts splintering as he fought the pull of the voices, the call of the lighthouse. There was no escaping, not anymore. And then, with one final horrifying realization, David understood the true nature of the fog. It wasn't just the sea that had claimed him. It was the lighthouse. And now, the fog would never let him go. The ship would continue its endless drift, and David Mallory, like all those before him, would be lost to the depths of the fog. Forever. David's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as though he were drowning. He staggered back from the wheel, clutching his head as the voices grew louder, a cacophony of whispers and wails from every corner of the ship. The shadows in the water seemed to gather in anticipation, as though they could sense his surrender, waiting for him to fully embrace his fate. It was no use. His body felt as if it were being pulled into the very fabric of the ship, as if his soul was being tethered to the fog. His thoughts became blurry, distant. Every attempt to push away the fog's influence felt weaker, less significant. The fog was not just around him. It was inside him, seeping into his mind, consuming his thoughts. "You cannot leave," the voices seemed to say in unison, now echoing inside his skull. "You are part of this world now." David's legs buckled beneath him, and he sank to the floor of the ship, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He looked up, dazed, and saw that the figures, those shadowy, phantom-like beings from the depths, were beginning to board the ship. They moved slowly, deliberately, their features indistinct, but their presence overwhelming. They seemed to glide over the surface of the water, not walking, but floating toward the ship, drawn to it, bound to it. Each of them was an echo of the past, lost sailors, forgotten souls, trapped in a world that was neither life nor death. Their eyes were dark, empty voids, their faces twisted into expressions of eternal longing and grief. They were a part of this ship, this cursed vessel, forever bound to its endless voyage. David tried to speak, but no words would come. His tongue felt heavy in his mouth, his voice strangled by the weight of the fog and the pressure building in his chest. He wanted to cry out, to beg, to plead for release, but it was as though the fog itself had silenced him, binding him to the ship's deck, preventing any escape. The figures drew nearer, their movements slow but purposeful, and David could see them now, close enough to touch. One of them reached out with a skeletal hand, its long, twisted fingers hovering just above his shoulder. David flinched, but there was nowhere to run. The ship was his prison, the fog his warden, and the voices. They were his jailers. Suddenly, a powerful force slammed into David, knocking him off his feet. He tumbled backward, his vision swimming as the ship rocked violently. The fog around him swirled, and for a moment he felt a cold, icy hand grab his ankle, pulling him toward the edge of the ship. Desperately, he clawed at the deck, trying to break free, but the grip tightened. His mind screamed in terror, but his body was paralyzed, completely at the mercy of the fog's power. The ship seemed to be sinking. No, not sinking. Drifting further into the heart of the fog, deeper into a place where there was no light, no escape. With a final panicked gasp, David realized what was happening. The ship wasn't going anywhere. It was simply drifting, endlessly, in the fog, going nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The lighthouse, the light, had not been a point of guidance. It had been a trap, a beacon calling him, luring him into its grasp. And now, he was a part of it. The ship shuddered violently again, and David's gaze lifted to the figures around him. They were everywhere now, swarming, surrounding him, their hollow eyes, their endless silence. It was like they were waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to accept the truth. In that moment, David understood. This was not a ship at all. It was a prison, a floating tomb, wandering the seas, forever lost in the fog. And he, along with the others before him, was destined to sail forever in this endless cycle. The fog seemed to thin just slightly, and through the mist, David saw it again. The lighthouse, now much farther in the distance, its light still flickering, still pulsing. But it wasn't the lighthouse he was meant to reach. It was a symbol of the curse. It was the end of every journey, the beginning of the end, and he was bound to it now. The ship creaked again, its timbers groaning in response to the pull of the fog, and David felt something in the pit of his stomach, the inevitable realization that he was no longer a man. He had become a part of the ship, part of the fog. His mind, his soul, was no longer his own. As the figures closed in, David's body stiffened and his mind went blank. He had no fight left in him. The fog had claimed him, and he, like the others, was now a permanent part of this cursed voyage. The ship drifted on, the fog swallowing it whole, pulling it into the void of the sea. The lighthouse blinked faintly in the distance, the last flicker of light in an otherwise endless dark. David Mallory was lost. Time had ceased to exist in this place. The ship, though caught in a timeless drift, carried on, as if moving through an eternal cycle. David's mind felt fractured, his sense of self slipping like water through his fingers. He could no longer tell if he was awake or dreaming, if the voices and whispers that filled his ears were real or merely figments of his imagination, twisted by the fog's relentless pull. He was no longer alone. He never had been. The lost souls, those shadowy figures from the depths, had gathered around him, their presence overwhelming. They were always just out of reach, their hollow eyes following him, their movements just a little too slow, too deliberate. Some stared, others whispered in languages David could not understand, and a few simply waited, as if watching for something to happen. David could feel their eyes on him, these lost souls who, like him, had been swallowed by the fog. They were not dead, not in the traditional sense. They were caught between realms, bound to the ship and its eternal voyage. And now, he was one of them. His mind was their mind. His fear was their fear. There was no longer any distinction between him and the others. He was part of the fog, part of the ship's endless drift. The ship creaked again, the sound reverberating through David's very bones. It was a low, mournful groan, like a beast that had been wounded long ago and had never healed. The fog around them seemed to thicken once more, darker and more oppressive, pressing in like the weight of 1,000 years. David stood at the railing, staring into the abyss that surrounded him. The water was calm, too calm, reflecting the pale light of the lighthouse in the distance. But the light was fading, flickering like a dying flame. The figures around him, the lost souls, seemed to stir. There was something in the air, something shifting. "Why are we here?" David whispered, his voice hoarse. "Why can't we leave?" No one answered. The souls were silent, their eyes empty, as though they too had long since lost the ability to speak. They had no more questions, just the endless wait. They had forgotten what it was like to have hope. David felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he spun around, his heart thumping wildly in his chest. There was no one there, but the touch lingered, chilled and real, a coldness that seemed to seep into his very bones. "Is anyone here?" "Please," David called out, his voice trembling with desperation. "I need to know what this is. Why are we stuck in this nightmare?" The fog swirled around him, thickening, and in the centre of it, a form began to materialize, a figure as tall and shadowy as the others. But this one was different. This figure moved with purpose, its movements sharp and deliberate. It was clothed in a tattered sailor's uniform, its face obscured by shadows, but the presence of the figure was undeniable. The figure stepped forward, and David felt his breath catch in his throat. It was different from the others. It had a power to it, a weight that the others did not. The eyes, David could barely make them out, but they gleamed with an intensity that sent a shock of cold fear through him. The figure stood before David, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then, the figure spoke, its voice low and steady. "You are the newest." David recoiled, unable to form words. The voice was not like the others. It was clear, commanding, as if it had a deep understanding of the place they were all trapped in. "The newest?" David managed to say, his throat dry. "What do you mean?" The figure tilted its head slightly, its expression unreadable beneath the shadows of its hood. "The lighthouse calls us all. It has called for centuries. Those who come, seeking the truth, are bound to the ship. You are now part of the cycle. You will wait, like the others, until your time comes." "Time for what?" David whispered, his voice barely audible. "To guide the next," the figure said, its voice a low murmur. "And the next. The ship is endless. You will never reach the shore. The fog is our home now. The ship is our destiny." David's blood ran cold. He understood now. The ship wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a vessel. It was a prison for the lost, for those who had been drawn to it, who had been called by the lighthouse. And now he was part of it. He would never escape. David took a step back, his mind racing. The weight of the words, the truth, sank in like a stone in his stomach. The figure's eyes locked onto him, unwavering. "You will guide others, David," it said, its voice a whisper that seemed to echo in David's mind. "You will be the one to bring them here, to the fog, to the ship. It is your fate now." David couldn't breathe. The words reverberated inside his skull, growing louder with each passing second. He fought to break free, to understand, to reject the impossible reality that had been forced upon him. But there was no escape. The fog had claimed him, the ship had claimed him, and the lighthouse, forever distant, forever unreachable, was a reminder of what they had all lost. The figure turned away, its form dissolving into the fog like smoke, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. David stood frozen, his heart heavy with the understanding of what he had become, a part of the endless cycle, just like the others. The ship drifted on, its course unchanged, its journey eternal. And as the lighthouse's light flickered faintly in the distance, David's mind began to dull, his will weakened by the fog that now filled every corner of his thoughts. He knew what was coming next. The whispers, the calls, they would not stop. Not until he too was one of the shadows, one of the lost souls that would forever wander the ship, drifting through the fog. In time, he would forget his name, his story, just as they all had. He would become part of the cycle, lost in the fog, guiding the next. The ship sailed on, endless, inescapable. David's perception of time was fading. Each moment felt like it stretched into infinity, and yet nothing changed. The fog remained as thick as ever, swaddling the ship in its cold, unyielding embrace. He could feel it in his veins now, the fog, a part of him, living inside him. He had become it, or it had become him. There was no difference anymore. The voices had quieted, for the most part. They no longer whispered in the same frantic, insistent tone. Now, there was only the quiet hum of the ship's movement and the occasional, distant wail that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the fog. The ship itself was moving, but it was no longer clear where it was headed, no more than the souls who wandered it could ever know. The cycle was complete. The fog was their home now. But there was something else, something different, about this moment, this point in the endless journey. For the first time since he had been drawn into the fog, David found himself able to look around, to really see. The fog had parted briefly, allowing him a glimpse of the horizon, or at least, he thought it was the horizon. The black water stretched out, endless and unknowable, like a yawning chasm, reaching toward a sky that never seemed to fully emerge from the mist. The lighthouse was far behind him now, its light a distant, fading memory, its pull barely perceptible. And yet, in this vast expanse of fog and water, David felt a presence, something new, a shift in the air. The fog around him seemed to stir, as though it was alive, responding to something or someone he couldn't see. "Who's there?" David asked, his voice rough and unsteady, though he didn't know why he had spoken aloud. He knew there was no one left to answer. The souls around him were silent, distant, too far gone to offer anything more than their hollow, watchful eyes. But then, from the corner of his vision, he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the deck, staring into the abyss. At first, David thought it might be another of the lost souls, just another shadow caught in the fog. But as he looked closer, something stirred within him, an unsettling realization that this was not like the others. The figure was solid, standing with purpose, its movements deliberate. David's heart skipped a beat as he stepped toward it. There was a strange familiarity in its presence, a pull that he couldn't explain. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment. The figure turned slowly, and David froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a weathered sailor's coat, his face obscured by the fog. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were locked onto David's. But what struck David most was not his appearance, but the feeling that radiated from him. This man was not like the others who had wandered this ship. He was different. He was awake. The man didn't speak immediately, but his presence was undeniable. The fog around him seemed to recede, as though it was unwilling to touch him, unwilling to cloud his form. There was something about him that felt ancient, something timeless. "Who are you?" David asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped forward, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David felt a spark of something like fear, but also curiosity. The man's gaze pierced him, and when he spoke, his voice was low, commanding, yet oddly familiar. "You're not lost yet." David frowned, confusion clouding his mind. "What do you mean?" "I've been here for, I don't know how long. I'm part of this. I can't leave." The man's eyes softened, a flicker of something resembling sorrow crossing his face. "That's what they all think, David. But you are different. You have not yet forgotten who you are. You are not fully part of the fog. Not yet." David shook his head, struggling to make sense of the words. "I don't understand. I don't know who I am anymore. I've been lost here for so long. This place, it's all I've known now." The man reached out, his hand hovering just above David's shoulder, his fingers trembling as if he were reaching across a vast distance. "The fog doesn't own you." "Not yet, but it will if you let it. The lighthouse, the ship, they don't just keep the lost, they keep the forgotten. Those who never know who they were before they came here, and those who will never leave. You're at the brink, David. You can still remember." David's pulse quickened. "Remember what?" "Remember who you are. You are more than this ship. You are more than the fog. But you must make a choice, David, before the fog takes everything, before it erases you." David's head spun, his thoughts a blur. He couldn't focus. The fog had clouded his memories, twisted his thoughts. But there was something in the man's words, something that made sense, something that awakened a part of him that he had thought was lost forever. "What do I have to do?" David asked, his voice trembling, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The man's expression was hard to read, but there was an undeniable understanding in his eyes. "You must leave the ship, leave the fog behind, walk away. It will not be easy. The fog will resist. The ship will fight you. But you are stronger than you realize." David took a step back, his mind reeling. Leave. It had been so long since he had even considered such a thing. He had become part of the ship, part of the fog. The thought of escaping it all seemed impossible. The voices, the whispers, the eternal journey. This was his life now, his reality. But then he looked at the man again, his eyes steady and unblinking. There was something in them, something that resonated deep within David. He had been lost for so long. But what if he could find a way out? David took a deep breath, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He could feel the pull of the fog, urging him to stay, to accept his place. But the man's words, they had lit something inside him, a flicker of hope, a flicker of who he used to be. The fog had always been with him, but maybe it didn't have to be forever. How? David whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. The man smiled faintly, a small, sad smile. You have to break free, David. You have to remember. The fog will try to drag you back, but you can fight it. It's not too late. David took another step, his hand reaching out for the railing. The fog pulsed around him, like it was waiting, watching. But for the first time, he felt something stir in his chest, a deep resolve. The man stepped back, disappearing into the mist with a final word. Remember who you are. David closed his eyes, his breath steadying. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he could truly escape the fog, the ship, or the endless drift of time. But he knew one thing. He would not let the fog erase him. He would fight to remember. With one final glance at the dark horizon, David Mallory turned, his heart beating with the faintest hope, and stepped forward into the unknown. David felt the weight of the fog pressing against him as he moved away from the ship's railing, but this time it didn't feel like the suffocating, inescapable presence it once had. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of clarity in his mind. The fog, once a thick barrier between him and the world, was now something he could fight against, something he could break free from. The ship creaked underfoot, groaning like it had been alive for centuries, and the whispers around him seemed to grow more desperate, as though sensing the shift. The figures, those lost souls, were still watching, their hollow eyes following his every movement. But now, David could feel their power waning. They were still trapped in the fog, bound to the ship, but he wasn't like them. He didn't have to stay. He could leave. He could remember. David took a deep breath, his feet moving with slow determination. The fog felt thinner now, not just physically, but in the way it pressed against his thoughts. The memories that had been buried beneath the haze began to stir, fragments of his past rising up like broken pieces of a puzzle. He remembered his name, his life before the fog. He had been a journalist. He had come to Point Reyes to write a story. But how long ago had that been? It seemed like a lifetime. The figure, the man who had appeared to him, had said something about breaking free. But how? How could he undo what had been done to him? Break the chains of fog that had bound him to this ship? David's heart raced as the fog around him began to stir. The light from the distant lighthouse flickered again, faint but visible. It was almost as if it was calling to him, its pulse faint but steady, a rhythmic beacon through the impenetrable dark. But now, the light no longer seemed like a distant promise of escape. It felt more like a reminder of the ship's eternal cycle, a cycle that he had nearly fallen into, a cycle that he had to break. He had been part of this ship for so long, adrift in the fog. But now, the fog no longer felt like home. It felt like a prison, a place where memories went to die, where souls were forgotten. David could hear the whispers again, but this time they were fading, their urgency diminishing as he moved further from the heart of the ship. The figures that had once seemed so close, so suffocating, now seemed distant, shadows fading into the mist. They were not a part of him anymore. They couldn't hold him here. He had already started to unravel their grip. "David?" one of the voices whispered, distant and hollow, like a memory just out of reach. "Come back. Stay with us." The voice was familiar, the same whisper that had followed him since his arrival. But now, David didn't feel its pull. He didn't feel the fear or the desperation he had felt before. The fog still swirled around him, but it no longer felt as though it were closing in on him. It was just fog, just mist. He could push past it. He took another step, then another. His resolve strengthened with each motion, his mind clearer now. Every piece of the puzzle was coming together. He remembered who he was. He wasn't meant to be here. He wasn't meant to drift in the fog, lost in the endless cycle of the ship. He had a life, a story to tell, a life beyond the fog. David paused as he reached the center of the deck, looking up at the distant lighthouse one last time. The light blinked again, its pulse slow and steady. And then something shifted. The fog around him rippled, as if reacting to his awareness, reacting to his determination. It was as though the ship and the fog were aware of his intent to break free. They fought against him, pulling at his thoughts, trying to drag him back into the cycle. The ship lurched again, creaking louder than before, and David stumbled. But he caught himself. The fog around him thickened in response to his resistance, trying to swallow him whole. But David didn't waver. He wasn't just running from the ship anymore. He wasn't trying to escape the fog. He was fighting to remember who he was. He was fighting for his freedom, for the chance to reclaim his life. With a final determined breath, David stepped forward, past the railing, into the fog. The moment his foot touched the mist, something inside him snapped. The world around him blurred, the fog twisting in all directions, as if protesting, trying to hold him in place. The voices, once so loud, were now whispers, faint echoes that barely reached his ears. The ship groaned, its timbers creaking in protest. But David didn't stop. He pushed forward, his every movement filled with purpose. And then, suddenly, the fog began to thin. It didn't part in a dramatic, violent way. Number. It receded slowly, gently, as if it were surrendering to him. The air became clearer, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, David saw the horizon. He could see the ocean stretching before him, vast and open, with the dark sky above. The lighthouse, now distant but still visible, no longer seemed like a warden. It was just a lighthouse, a marker in the distance. David stepped forward again, his feet finding solid ground, and the fog continued to retreat. It was no longer a prison. It was simply a mist, something natural. And as the fog parted, he felt something else, a lightness, a clarity that he hadn't known in what felt like ages. He was free. For a moment, David just stood there, on the edge of the deck, looking out over the endless ocean. His heart, which had been heavy for so long, now felt lighter. The weight of the fog, the ship, and the souls that had once surrounded him was gone. He wasn't just free of the ship. He was free of the fog's hold on his mind, on his memories. But there was no time to waste. As the fog continued to recede, David knew he had to leave. He had to find his way back to the world he had once known, to the life he had nearly forgotten. And the only way out was forward. With one final look at the lighthouse, David turned away from the ship. He didn't look back as he walked toward the edge of the deck, stepping out into the open sea. For the first time since he had arrived, the fog didn't follow. It remained behind, slipping away like a bad dream. David Mallory was free. And the ship, the fog, the endless journey would drift on without him.